welcome back, my lovelies. This is True Crime with me, Emma Kenny, and if you just happen to have arrived here by mistake, maybe it's been recommended and you're wondering, who am I? Well, I release crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously. So as I say, if you like crime and consistency, then I am your girl. Also, big shout out to all of you who support me. Thank you every time you come back. It blows my mind. Can't believe you do. Thanks to all my subscribers and my new subscribers. I appreciate you massively. It sounds very narcissistic to say that I like the kind of numbers going up, but I do. I enjoy the fact that people come and watch my content. Thank you to all my Patreon followers. You are making it so that I can make better content and also get amazing people to come on and do podcasts with me. So I appreciate all of your support. Give me a like, get your notifications on so you know when I release content, and also give me a comment because I do read them all. And I like them. And I think I will carry on reading them no matter how many I get in the future. That may one day just be my job, to just read the comments. The case I'm going to do today is infuriating. Just going to prepare you. There is an infuriation level when I talk you through it. Any of you who know me know that I have a bit of an issue with corruption. It exists, usually in places it shouldn't, and in people with power, often it is so dire that when you expose the lies and corruption, you end up feeling completely blindsided, because the reality is that people in professional situations or positions where they're meant to be protective and powerful, when it's them who are corrupt, it kind of breaks down your understanding of what makes a civilized and decent society. So the case that I'm going to talk about today is involving that. So I'm going to tell you the story of what happened to David Camm. So on the 11th of January 1992, Indiana State Trooper David Camm responds to a report that two brothers who've been going hunting have found a body on the side of Lemon Road, north of Madison. Now, Camm is a decorated police officer, very well respected. He's one of the first on the scene, and what meets his sight in that moment is just truly horrific. The charred remains of a young woman. And also, this is a very unusual crime in the area that this particular officer works. This is not a violent area. So these kind of murders are very unusual. Now, that body turned out to be the body of 12-year-old Shanda Shara, which, if you are interested, is a case that I covered in my previous true crime video. So this officer turns up to find Shanda literally burnt to death, and he's the first responder. 4 teenage girls later were convicted of her torture and killing, but that particular brutal crime stayed with David Camm his entire life. Now, Shanda Shara's murder was a media sensation. It really was, because there was this brutal nature of the murder. It was committed by teenagers. It was a 12-year-old child, so she was an incredibly young victim. It was also within the context of a lesbian love triangle, which was unusual because of her age, and it dominated the headlines at that time. I would say, because of that, Camm probably would have thought that he would never be involved in a more significant crime in his entire career, in his entire life. 8 years later, he wouldn't just be proved wrong. Events would catastrophically change his life. Around 9:30 p.m, 28th of September 2000, Sellersburg police in Clark County, Indiana, respond to a call. It's Camm. He's calling from his family home in Georgetown. Emergency services received this distraught call from David Camm, and he's saying, "Call everybody out to my house now. My wife and kids are dead."
Dave?
Get everybody out here to my house now!
Okay, all right.
My wife and my kids are dead!
Everything's gonna be okay, all right? We're gonna get people.
Everything's not okay! Get everybody out here now!
They're coming. Go to Dave Camm's house now. Okay. Do you know what happened, David?
No! They're dead! I just don't...
I mean, can you imagine the person making that phone call? What you've returned to? What's played out in front of your eyes? Your whole family annihilated. It turns out shortly before that phone call, Camm had returned home. He'd been playing basketball at Georgetown Community Church gym. He did this every Thursday with his friends and other church members. He'd actually resigned as an Indiana State Trooper just 4 months earlier. He'd been in that career for 10 years. And the reason he'd done that was he decided to get involved with a family business with his uncle. When his electric garage door opened, he was greeted with the most horrific sight. The bodies of his wife, 35-year-old Kim, and his 2 young children, 7-year-old Bradley and 5-year-old Jill. And I don't even know how to compute that reality. The psychological brutality of witnessing such a scene is beyond comprehension. 7-year-old child, 5-year-old child, all 3 of them had been shot. His wife was lying on the garage floor. She had a pool of blood around her. She had been shot in the head, but she had clearly struggled. She'd fought for her life. Bizarrely, her trousers had been removed and her shoes had also been removed, but they'd been neatly placed on the roof of her Ford Bronco SUV. It's quite an unusual thing for a perpetrator to have done. It sounds almost ritualistic, doesn't it? The fact that they're going out of their way to neatly fold the trousers and the shoes. There's a suggestion there of some kind of planned experience, potential fantasy play. In the back seat of the vehicle, the children had been shot. So Jill was still wearing her seatbelt. She'd been shot in the head. And Bradley had tried to escape, as you can imagine he would. You would imagine the horror in that child's experience. And he tried to climb into the back cargo area of the vehicle, and that's where he'd been shot in his chest. Now, according to Camm, he could clearly see immediately when that electric door had gone up and he'd seen his daughter and his wife that they were dead. But he did think at that point in time that his son may still be alive. So he leans into the back of his vehicle, across Jill's body, and he removes Bradley from the back seat. He then placed him on a grey sweatshirt on the floor and he attempts CPR. Understandably, he's been shot in his chest. So blood starts pouring from Brad's mouth, and that meant that the efforts of his father proved fruitless. He then called the police before running to his grandfather's house nearby to try and get help where his uncle, who was also a former police officer, was staying. Imagine how desperate he was. I mean, the fact that his initial experience is to, yes, call the police, but then to just desperately go and get support, you can see the trauma, can't you? Like running to his elders, running home, trying to get people to make it better. There's something about those situations where you just want to go home to your tribe, and it doesn't surprise me for 1 minute that David Camm did that. Now, obviously the police get there quickly. This is a triple homicide, and they begin the usual process of securing the scene, collecting the evidence. Now, Floyd County Prosecutor Stan Faith, keep that name in mind, you'll understand why in the future. He arrives around 10 p.m, takes over the investigation. This, as far as I'm concerned, is when I look at the information around this case and the research around this case, this is where it all starts going wrong. So the minute that Stan Faith turns up, things start going sideways. Now, on the face of it, when people are looking in to that scene, it's a tragic triple homicide. However, we have a problem because there isn't an obvious motive for the crime. So nothing's been stolen. Yes, a struggle has taken place and all 3 victims have been shot, but it's not obvious what the intruder who murdered them was trying to achieve. So it wasn't a home invasion gone wrong. And that makes it more difficult to assume why this crime had played out. Now, investigators also noticed drops of blood on the bottom of Camm's t-shirt. Remember, he's given CPR to his son. This is a bit of an issue as far as they're concerned, because that t-shirt with drops of blood on is going to get investigated, of course. And it turns out the way that the investigation gets pointed in a new direction is by a guy called Rob Stites. And this guy, Rob Stites, is someone who basically heavily guides the whole investigation. Stan Faith had actually made an immediate decision to hire Rod Englert, who's a private forensics analyst based in Oregon. He's also a blood spatter and crime scene analyst. Sadly, and it is sadly, he's unavailable, so he sends his crime scene photographer, Stites, instead. Now, Stites on the surface of this is apparently a professor at Portland State University. So if you're a professor at a university, you're going to be highly qualified in a particular field. Also, he's in the process of attaining a PhD in fluid dynamics. He would prove probably one of the most highly significant figures in the investigation. Now, Jim Nimier, he's the most experienced detective on this case in this moment in time. And he pretty much from the get-go looks at Stites and thinks, you are not qualified. And he expresses this to his superiors. He says he doesn't want somebody unqualified, inexperienced, and also an individual who could potentially do harm to the investigation being on the crime scene. However, his concerns are rebuffed, and he's told that Faith wants Stites to be involved. So his superior is basically saying, this is happening. But you can see the very fact that you have a highly experienced, highly qualified, diligent, discerning, probably a bit moral and ethical detective who's saying that should draw our attention immediately to some concerns about Stites, but also about Faith's ideas behind who should be involved. Now, Englert initially only told Faith that Stites was going to be there to document evidence and take photos, but that isn't how it plays out. Stites does so much more than taking photographs, and the reality is that investigators end up relying on him pretty much fully, not just to read the crime scene, but to reconstruct the crime scene. Now, bear in mind what that means. If you are bringing in an expert, and the expert is now going from being the photographer who's just going to take a few pictures to how did this happen? What played out? What are your thoughts about who may be guilty? How did this crime become a reality? I mean, on two levels, that's problematic. One, if you're not qualified, it's problematic. This is highly specialised. But two, ego is a problem in life. Look, we all know that. We want to be humble. We want to show humility. But you know, if people are saying how great you are or that you're suddenly the big expert, often you can exaggerate or amplify because you don't have the experience, but you want to behave in a way that seems that you do. And that means that you give people information that sometimes isn't true because you want people to value and validate you. And that's the problem. When you're a real expert, you don't mind pissing people off. When you're a real expert, you don't mind not giving people what they want because you're an expert. Your job is to do what you know to do. If you're not, and you get validation and positive strokes, then often you will give people things that you feel will enamor them to you. And it feels like from the very beginning, we have a problem where Stites is doing this. So he advises police that 8 drops of blood on Camm's t-shirt were high velocity impact spatter. Now what that means is blood spatter caused by high speed impact, such as from a gunshot, which obviously this scene has had multiple gunshots. This has happened. And he suggests that Camm must have been near the bodies when they were shot. And he even apparently confirms this with his boss, Englert, on the phone. Bear in mind, we know that Englert really is an expert. Now, after the call, he tells investigators he was 100% certain blood was high velocity impact spatter. Always worries me when somebody says it's 100% certain. There's a lot of statistics in the past few years I've heard where it's 100% certain, only to find out it's not 100% certain. But nonetheless, again, if you want to seem like you know what you're doing, you're going to give them absolutes. You're going to give them no room for a mistake here. It's 100% certain. Now, Stites' report also indicated that it was clear an attempted clean-up had occurred prior to the authorities arriving. And we all know that in lots of homicide cases, people do try to clean the scene up. This would not be unusual. And the reason that he particularly drew out this theory is that he stated a long ribbon of blood on the floor from Kim's head, so David Camm's wife, went from dark red to clear. Now he claims this colour difference was indicative of a hasty attempt to clean up the gore. Basically claimed the blood had been manipulated by high pH cleaning substance. Meanwhile, the time of death was estimated to be around 9:30 p.m. That's around the time that Camm makes the call to the police, claiming to have just discovered his family dead. So the police are now starting to suspect that Camm's version of events may not be true. In fact, they go so far as to start believing that he's present when his family's been killed. Now, stereotypically, on a generalised level, I agree. Often the case in crimes involving killing of women and children involve suspicion falling on the husband or father, because let's think about Chris Watts. They frequently do turn out to be the perpetrators. And that, therefore, is not an assumption that we can blame the police for actually toying with. Because if 9 out of 10 times the husband or the partner is the person who's killed the family, then 9 out of 10 times the police are going to consider that as a potential. So it makes sense. But obviously, you have to get evidence for that to become a reality, right? You can have an assumption, and then your job is to disprove that assumption with evidence, or to prove that assumption with evidence. I will also note that as soon as this crime gets reported, it isn't just the police who start thinking that this was David Camm. In fact, public opinion seem to agree. People start commenting on his lack of emotion during interviews, for example, which drives me bonkers. I am the first to note that often in the UK and in the States and other countries, Australia in particular, we use press conferences and interviews to analyse whether somebody is acting according to what we believe they should be doing. So for those of you who've never heard of the Mick Philpott case, if you go back and watch one of my earlier videos on him, the press conference very much demonstrated that he was guilty as hell. Should have just dragged him off then and locked him up and thrown up the graded key. It was just obvious. But there are lots of different ways that people feel when they've just lost people that they love. One is hysterical. One is unable to control themselves in every interview, understandably. It's incredibly triggering. For others, it is so overwhelming, so incredibly brutalizing within their mind that they just switch off. There is a numbness. They just compose themselves and act accordingly as if from a script to just stay sane. And I'll give you a good example. When I was a young girl, I remember a friend of mine, her mother dropped dead. She had a brain hemorrhage. She was sent to school the next day and just expected to carry on. And she kind of just did. Now, she was in overwhelming grief. She wasn't okay at all. She was in a horrendous place, but her brain just couldn't deal with the gravity of that, so it only allowed her to just function. So when somebody doesn't look emotional, that can often mean that still waters are running incredibly deep and they haven't even got to a point where they've acknowledged that the reality has occurred. But the point is, because we have an expectation, this person has lost his family, he should be hysterical, he should be crying, he should be in pieces. If you don't fit that paradigm, you can easily find yourself being judged as somebody cold, calculating even. And that is a big problem. Arguably, if you wanted to pretend that you were innocent and you were guilty, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to think, well, probably I need to get a bit hysterical. And we see that very often in, shall we say, Diane Downs' video, where she's pretending to be sad but then smiles. She has duper's delight. And lots of other individuals who've been put in front of the press and tried to cry but haven't managed it but seem to be distressed. He doesn't do that. So if anything, this not being emotional would say that that was quite authentic to me. But like I said, the court of public opinion disagrees. The police are also under pressure. There's been 3 homicides, 2 babies essentially, 2 children. And so there's a real pressure on them to make an arrest. And it feels like the investigators at this point have just got their sights on David Camm. However, understandably, rightfully so, the first thing they need to do is to establish sufficient probable cause for arrest so that they can charge him. Bit of a problem there. Bit of a problem. Just a tiny little bit of a problem. What could that problem be? Oh, I'll tell you what that problem could be. David Camm has a massive alibi. Not a small alibi. Not a, ooh, I went to the shops and there's somebody on a camera that looks kind of similar to me if I just do this with my hair. No. David Camm has an alibi because he was playing basketball from 7 p.m. to around 9:30 p.m. And guess what? There was a team there. So David Camm was not at the scene of the crime. But prosecutors never want to think, well, that seems quite a logical, linear explanation. We should probably accept that David Camm is innocent. They're like, is he innocent? I mean, he sounds innocent. But let's just explore that for a minute. Why don't we purport there's another option? So he says, you know what? We know that David Camm was apparently at this particular basketball that they're talking about from 7 till 9:30. But actually, now I've looked at the home telephone records, I can see a call had been made by David Camm at 7:19 p.m. At which point, Kim and children hadn't arrived home. Therefore, they felt that David Camm was lying. He'd been home earlier and he'd made the call. Okay, so now they've got this weird piece in the jigsaw. Still can't account for the fact that the kids and the mother weren't actually in at that point, so doesn't necessarily mean that he did do it, does it? But they're like, never one to think that that's kind of not that important. Let's just build a bit more of a case. So they go, how do we figure out what the motive is? Because we need a motive. We can't just have like a flimsy telephone call. So let's look at David Camm's personal life and what they discover, and it never looks good for guys and girls in situations like this, is they discover lots of allegations of repeated infidelity. So David Camm is guilty of being unfaithful. It seemed to be a serial adulterer. The investigators then think to themselves, well, this is it. Cheating on a wife, wants her out of the way. Doesn't want to be a dad anymore, doesn't want to be a husband and father, so he could divorce them and be an absent father or become a triple homicide murderer. But obviously the police are like, yeah, he's probably gone for the triple homicide murderer. That seems like way easier than just getting divorced. But okay, let's go with the investigators' thought process. Faith basically looks at that and believes, yeah, I've got sufficient probable cause to both arrest and charge David Camm. As far as Faith was concerned, he knew why Camm wanted his wife dead. Also, Faith clings on to this piece of evidence as far as he's concerned, that David Camm said he played basketball until 9:30 p.m. But he said that because they had the phone call, it proved that he'd been home earlier. And this is the theory. They decide that David Camm had hidden in the garage, waited for the family to arrive back. They'd arrived back around 9:30 p.m. He'd then shot them to death. Then he tried to clean up the scene, but he gave up and then he called the police. I mean, that sounds logical, doesn't it? So you tried to clean up the scene, but then go, oh, I'll just do half a job. And now just call the police and no one will notice. Bear in mind, this guy had been a police officer. I'm just throwing it out there. You know, when you're thinking about logic, linearity, things making sense. But the prosecutor goes on to say, yep, even though he claimed to have discovered the bodies upon his return, the blood splatter on the clothing actually indicates that he'd been present when the killings took place. And that meant that 3 days after the killings, 1st of October 2000, Camm's arrested and charged with the murder of his wife and children. On the face of it, I imagine you could say, well, the investigators have established a relatively strong case against him. However, the investigation against Camm genuinely, even for somebody like myself who's unschooled in the prosecution and legal system, at least I have an understanding, but certainly I'm not educated in that area. But even for somebody like me to look into the actual research of this, it is clear that the case against Camm certainly is less than watertight. And I'll tell you why. So first of all, let's look at the phone call. It hadn't been made at 7:19 p.m. In fact, there had been a mix-up by the phone company because of Indiana's complicated time zones. So it had happened at 6:15. So that means that Camm likely wasn't present when the killings occurred. Also, let's look at the alibi, and it's a massive alibi. You couldn't get a tighter alibi. There's 11 witnesses who say he played basketball from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. In fact, till after 9 p.m. to be specific. Now, maybe Camm had finished playing basketball, returned home, and then killed his family, because the time of death at this point is believed to be around 9:30 p.m. Apparently not. So bear in mind what I've just told you about the evidence and the fact that they had assumed, right, part of the prosecution, that the murders had taken place around 9:30 p.m. No. The autopsy revealed the original time of death estimation to be way out. So victims had actually been killed around an hour and a half earlier, around 8 p.m. they believe the killings occurred. Again, Camm has a perfect alibi. He's playing basketball at this time. Now, meanwhile, Stites' allegation that an attempted cleanup has occurred was also questioned. And I'll tell you why. It seems that he'd misinterpreted natural separation of blood when exposed to air, now that's known as serum separation, as a cleanup attempt. So he's completely confused a naturally occurring process when blood is exposed to air as a cleanup attempt. Turns out he'd never actually been to a crime scene with fresh blood. Bear in mind, this highly experienced professor never seen a fresh blood crime scene. Also, Stites' findings of other high-velocity impact blood spatter sites at the crime scene also believed to be completely inaccurate. Namely, bloodstains on garage door, shower curtains, breezeway siding, a mop and a jacket. So his credibility starts to be questioned. Faith also claims that a neighbour has heard 3 gunshots from Camm's residence around the time that Camm arrived home. It wasn't true. Because even though the neighbour said that she'd heard 3 loud bangs, like someone banging fists on the car, well, that turns out that after Camm discovers the murdered bodies of his family, he ends up banging his fist on the tailgate several times because, understandably, he's completely traumatised, angry, shocked. So he's banging on the tailgate because he's in such dramatic pain. Now, investigators had also been aware of that and known that this is one of the ways that he'd responded and reacted because he told them. But I'll be honest, as far as they've got in their heads, they believe that the gunshot theory is a probable cause to arrest Camm. So even though he's admitted that he struck the tailgate several times, the police still believe that because the neighbour who wasn't there, who heard 3 bangs and did think it was like somebody banging on a car, which it was somebody banging on a car, they still feel that it gives them probable cause to arrest Camm.
We got some problems with things the way they are. And that's why, you know, we brought you here. We would give you the opportunity.
Morons.
We keep,
I cannot believe. I cannot believe this.
what do you mean? You can't believe what?
You are going to try to blame me for killing my children and my daughter.
This leads to a bit of a problem though, right? Because remember what the original theory was about what had happened and how it played out and time details and so on and so forth. So investigators actually need to tweak their initial theory, and stay with me on this because I'm going to talk about tweaking theories quite a lot throughout this case. So they need to tweak it because Camm's got an alibi. So they say to themselves, okay, how do we figure this one out? Right, we've got it. We've got it. What happened was David Camm manages to sneak out of the basketball game, kill his whole family around 8 p.m, and then rejoin the game without being spotted. Is it just me? Is it just me who has a problem with this suggestion? I have played team sports. I am yet to remember an occasion during said team sports where a member of team disappears for a period of time and no one notices. I mean, maybe a loo break for 5 minutes, not during an intense period of competition when you're required, but we're talking quite a long period of time. You're just going to be like, where's David Camm gone? Why are we missing this player? That does not happen. But apparently, as far as the police are concerned. It's no big deal. This is the kind of shit that happens all the time. Because apparently David Camm's house is only a few minutes away, then it could have occurred. I also want you to consider this, that not only is the house a few minutes away, but it seems that somehow David Camm managed to get there whilst his wife was coming in from some activity, because obviously they're in the garage, which makes the whole timing situation seem a little bit strange, doesn't it? I mean, how would he know all of those things? And also, how would he get back to the game without being covered in blood and so on and so forth? You know, what is this time frame? Does he stop time? Has he got some kind of machine that freezes it so he can just go ahead and get away with all this stuff with no one noticing? It's bizarre. Can he teleportate? It's another question that I want to ask. But nonetheless, this is the theory. This is the theory. Also, there's still two pretty strange anomalies that aren't explained. So first of all, Kim's shoes. They've been neatly placed on the roof of her SUV. Now think about that crime scene. It's pretty messy. Why has somebody diligently placed the shoes on the roof of the SUV? Also, the sweatshirt that Bradley's body has been placed on. It was prison issue. It had the name Backbone handwritten in black ink on the inside collar. I mean, prison issue with a name written into the inside collar. That's surely going to alert the police, right? They're going to be like, wait a minute, there's a literal prison issue sweatshirt here with a name in it. Maybe we should investigate this. Also, that sweatshirt contains DNA of 2 unknown individuals. Now, investigators had run samples through CODIS, that's the Combined DNA Index System, a criminal DNA database. But apparently, it had returned no matches. By the way, defense attorneys, so people defending the individual who is accused, they're actually not allowed to access CODIS. Only prosecutors are allowed to do that. I don't get that either. You're all shaking your head. I don't get it either. But that's the way it goes. So the first trial, we get to the first trial. Can you believe it? David Camm is up for murder. And he takes a stand, pleads not guilty to 3 counts of murder. 14th of January 2002, the case goes to trial. Now, the prosecution claims that the motive for killings was Camm's repeated infidelity. They presented numerous witnesses who had claimed to have affairs with or been propositioned by Camm. It's clearly an attempt to character assassinate him. That's what the prosecution wants to do. If they can make the jury feel that this man has, shall we say, questionable ethics, then that can help them make the leap. Now, the reality is, think about all the people who have had affairs. They are very unlikely to kill anybody. Having an adulterous nature or being unhappy in a relationship with your partner does not lead to murder pretty much ever. There is a tiny percentage of times that occurs. But as a jury, it's my job as the prosecutor to convince you that this person is bad, has a character that's bad. And if you could have numerous affairs, I mean, what kind of a stretch would that be to make you a triple homicide murderer of children and partner? Even though it's a big leap, it makes it easier. If I don't like you, if maybe I feel that you're not a good human being, you've treated your wife badly, you weren't the dad you should have been, even though there's no evidence for that, aside from these witness testimonies that he's been adulterous, because you can be adulterous and still be a good partner as far as your partner is concerned. Yes, I appreciate it's not good behaviour, but it doesn't make you a terrible human being, and it certainly doesn't make you an awful dad. But if I can manipulate that jury to just think, well, he wasn't a great human, if he's capable of being deceptive behind his wife's back, what else is he deceptive of? And that's how you start to undermine the character of the individual being prosecuted. It's clever because that's how you start to get juries to turn, even when the evidence is compellingly saying that they're innocent. Now, the main evidence against Camm was Stites' findings of high velocity impact blood spatter. Yes, I know, guys, we already know. Stight hasn't even been to a crime scene before. But let's not throw that in. Let's not wonder whether that should be allowed in, because it was, and the prosecution were allowed to use it. So this blood spatter on Cam's shirt, they claim that this evidences he's a shooter. In court, Faith continually referred to Stites as Professor. Except he wasn't. Stites also tells the jury that he had investigated murders for the Army, Naval Intelligence, and the FBI. Stites should have a nose that just grows, because it would be easier then to see the lies play out. Because guess what? All that's a lie. Bear in mind, this is under oath, and this is dealing with the freedom of a man. This is also dealing with the potential sending down of an innocent person who is dealing with the brutal slaying of his entire family. And Stites got on that stand and he perjured himself beyond belief. The defence, of course, go out of their way to emphasise the obvious weaknesses of the prosecution case. So the blood spatter, they actually get a wig, cover it in blood, and then they demonstrate how similar markings can be made just through contact with clothing. Also, blood spatter analysis wasn't a strict science. Similar markings could be made in lots of different ways, and because of that, you have to consider that that's a possibility. If you can prove that these markings can occur in different ways, then you have to acknowledge that somebody can't definitively say 100% this is how they happened. They argue that Cam's shirt had touched Jill's blood-soaked hair as he'd reached across for his son. They were transfer stains, basically. As far as they were concerned, they weren't high-velocity impact spatter. Also, the bloody grey prison-issue sweatshirt. This had actually been placed in the body bag with Bradley, and for some bizarre reason, it had been largely overlooked as evidence by investigators. Now remember, at this point, the DNA hasn't been identified, but also they bring in the fact that Cam has a really solid alibi. Could he really have sneaked out, killed his family, and returned without people noticing? There were 11 people who witnessed him there that night. Now, the prosecution argue that the people playing basketball in church just hadn't been focused on Cam. No, they would have been focused on the ball and doing things like throwing the ball to Cam and knowing how many people were in their area, because that's what you do as sports people. So of course they'd have noticed if he was there or not. The reason they said he was there was because they did notice. But the prosecution say, look, his home was a few minutes away. He could have sneaked out, killed his family, and returned without anyone noticing. Said no sensible person ever, let alone a prosecution. But nonetheless, this is playing out in court. Now remember, for a not guilty verdict, all the defence need to prove is reasonable doubt. Now I ask you, is there reasonable doubt? Because as far as I am concerned, there is so much reasonable doubt right now, it should never have led even to an arrest of David Camm, let alone to a trial. And we are in scary territory right now. This is America. This is not a place where people get dealt with well when they have murdered people. It's retribution. It's a life imprisonment. You're not going to see the light of day. So if there is doubt, then it needs to be thrown out. It's a not guilty, pure and simple. And I think I've outlined quite a lot of doubt by this point, haven't I? On the 17th of March 2002, after 3 days deliberation, the jury fined David Camm guilty of murdering his family. Now, I'll note that there were 3 days deliberation, and damn straight there will have been, because I guarantee there will have been some jurors in that situation going, man, this guy is not guilty. We have not got enough evidence. And the thing about the jury effect is I bet you your bottom dollar there were some aggrieved individuals with history of adultery and situations similar to that, or they know people who've been harmed by people who've had affairs and they were the ones who stuck to their ground and were like, this guy is guilty. And in the end, it's amazing how you can bring those who don't agree with you to a position of agreement. And he gets guilty. He gets sentenced to 195 years in prison. There's a massive mixed reaction to the verdict. You know, obviously a lot of people feel that the right man's been convicted. Others immediately from the get-go say this is a serious miscarriage of justice. As is always the case in the States and in most places, there's an appeal. So at this point, the defence team appeals the conviction and argues that the evidence of Camm's infidelity had unfairly prejudiced the case. You know, the jury were convinced that he was a bad person because of this. Also, the prosecution have actually produced no evidence linking the alleged infidelity to the killings. So it's not like David Camm had been going around having affairs and saying, I want my wife dead. Do you know somebody who can organise it for me? You know, and they are things that we expect, or conversations in between the people that he's having sex with, which might be pillow talk orientated about, wouldn't it be great if my wife and family disappeared? None of this has happened, in spite of them getting witness testimonies about infidelity. So in August 2004, Indiana Court of Appeals agreed that they needed to look at this. They overturn the conviction. A retrial is ordered. February 2005, the defence request that 2 DNA samples from the sweatshirt, you know the sweatshirt, the one with a name in it, from a prison, they're like, can we please run the DNA through the CODIS again? But remember, the defence can request it, but they can't go ahead and do it. So they ask the prosecution about this, and the prosecution go, no, you can't. What? I just want to know who the 2 potential accomplices or suspects or accessories or, you know, just people who shouldn't have been there were there. I just want to know who they are. And the prosecution are like, no, because that might alter the way that the jury think, or it might mean that the innocent guy gets to go home. Can't have that happening. So they say no. Fortunately, at this point, the court intervene and say, you need to. This time, they find a match for one of the profiles. It's 44-year-old Charles Boney. He's a career criminal. He's a convicted felon with a history of attacking women and stealing their shoes. So he's got a real foot fetish. And he's actually known as the infamous shoe bandit. This is massively significant. Just think about it. Think about the crime scene. The careful placement of Kim's shoes on the vehicle. And this guy even says to the police, this may seem strange, but I have a thing for ladies' legs and feet. You know, actually, it's not that unusual. I do believe there's quite a market for people selling socks and shoes that are used. That may be something I do in my retirement, just gonna say, because if people want to buy stuff like that, I seem to think that's not too terrible at the end of the day. As far as the paraphernalia goes, it seems less problematic than many. But obviously in this case, the guy is completely deranged and incredibly dangerous. So he's got this fetish, and he likes to target, when he attacks women, people who are wearing trousers, because he reckons that he can look at a woman and see that they have nice legs. Kim had been wearing trousers that day, and he'd made her remove them during the actual struggle. Also, at the time of the murders, he's on probation. So he's recently been released from prison, literally a few months before, and he'd served time for armed attacks on women. So he's got this real MO. And some of those women who were attacked, he stole their shoes. In fact, the most recent attack that they had recorded was armed robbery of 3 women and attempted abduction at gunpoint in Bloomington, Indiana, and he steals their shoes. He served nearly 10 years for that. Also, there was evidence that he stalked some of his victims, so he made dirty phone calls, he asked them about their footwear, he threatened to shoot previous victims in the head. Bear in mind, Kim and Jill had both been shot in the head. But the pièce de résistance is, guess what his nickname was in prison? Backbone. Same name, written in prison issue sweatshirt found at the crime scene. Also, Kim's DNA would later be found on the sleeve of that sweatshirt. So this is consistent with Boney's arm around her neck and coming into contact with her mouth. So we now have his DNA at the scene of the crime. And do you want to know what's even worse about this information that I'm telling you? You remember earlier on I was talking about the DNA profiles that went through CODIS in the first instance. Turned out that they didn't find anyone. You know why? Because the prosecutors never ran the DNA profiles through CODIS in the first place. Even though Stan Faith had assured the defence that this had been done. Now, Faith claims he asked for it to be run through CODIS. The lab said, no, you didn't. You never made the request. Boney's DNA profile had been logged on CODIS 3 years prior to the killings in 1997. It would have found a match. Had Faith had it tested, as he claimed he did, this could and should have been established from the outset. The second mystery DNA profile found to belong to Marla Singh Mattingly. That's Boney's girlfriend at the time. Now the police interview her. And she tells them that on the night of the murders, he'd arrived home just after midnight, sweating, out of breath, excited. He had scrapes to his knees. He'd shown her a gun. And the next morning, in front of her, he'd argued with his own mother about the coverage of the killings on the news. So Boney had clearly been involved in the killings to some degree. Foot fetish explains why Kim's shoes were neatly placed on the vehicle amid this massive scene of carnage. Kim also had bruises and abrasions on top of both of her feet. Clear similarity in modus operandi of his previous crimes. So we can all agree that this guy is bang to rights right now. Boney's brought in for questioning and he takes a lie detector, and unsurprisingly, you will be unshocked to hear that it shows deception when he's asked if he's been involved in the shootings. Now he claims in his defence, look, I no longer own this sweatshirt, I donated it to the Salvation Army. Yes, I imagine you have. I imagine that when people go into the Salvation Army charity shop, the first thing that they look for is for a prison issue top. I imagine that's the kind of look they're going for. Can I look like somebody on day release or as if I've escaped from prison? But okay, Boney, let's go with you on this. So that's what he says is the reason he doesn't have it. He also at that point states he doesn't know and has never met David Camm. So they obviously go to trial, send him to prison forever. No, they don't do that. They release him. Well, I mean, it makes perfect sense. He's told us that it's not his top. He's donated that to the Salvation Army. And the reality is that he just happens to be a charitable soul with a history of violent abuse towards women who had nothing to do with this exact MO'd murder where the shoes were on top of the car. And at the end of the day, he said he didn't do it, even though he's failed a lie detector test. So we should totally set him free. That happened. And I'm not making light of it because accept my sarcasm is about disbelief that they've just put a bloke back into society who's likely murdered 2 children and another woman and probably is going around doing the most horrendous things to females per se, and they think it's all right for him to be walking the streets. So on the 4th of March 2005, Boney is finally arrested when a handprint is found on the outside passenger door of Kim's SUV and it's confirmed to be his. Why on earth did they delay this evidence? Think about that. Think of all the things that could go wrong right now in this situation. Investigators had originally believed the fingerprints were apparently not clear enough to run through the system for a match, but guess what? They were wrong again. They're making a lot of errors in this case. You know, some may suspect that they decided that somebody was guilty and then just decided to fit them up with as much information as possible, even if it meant actually avoiding getting correct evidence. You know, somebody could suspect that that's what they were doing, couldn't they? That they were just totally blagging it because they decided that they wanted a certain individual to be guilty. Now, Boney at this point is charged with murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Investigators now believe that he and Camm have carried out the killings together. I know, my head was exploding at this point as well. So even though the prosecution are like, okay guys, how do we get Camm involved in this still? You know, we've kind of invested a lot of information and detail and desire into this scenario where Camm is guilty. So how can we make it so Camm is still involved? And they're like, oh, well, maybe Boney can admit that he was involved. And Boney's like, yeah, I don't know him and I've never played basketball with him. Now, obviously, because of due process in the States, Boney needs a lawyer. And guess who steps in to be that lawyer? Yes, he's represented by none other than Stan Faith. Yeah, Stan Faith. You know the guy who really wants David Camm to be totally guilty? Stan Faith. The guy who's not allowed DNA to be actually ran through CODIS. Stan Faith. Person who lied about even getting those results. Yeah, him. Seems like something would be a good idea, isn't it? He's got no particular vested interest in David Camm being guilty, has he? So this prosecutor from Camm's first trial, who's ignored obvious evidence, including DNA on sweatshirts, apparently he's friends with Boney's mum, and apparently has been for decades. So Boney has been in contact with Faith several weeks even before his arrest. And he's been discussing the case with him. This is massively unprofessional, by the way. This should be enough to get Faith struck off. But despite this, Faith had not identified Boney to authorities. So bear in mind, this man has been in contact with Faith, clearly a potential killer, and Faith hasn't actually spoken to the authorities about it. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that Faith in the long term says that he didn't do anything wrong. And he says that as far as he's concerned, what he's acted in is a professional manner. I think we can all make our own assumptions about that. Now, it turns out Faith isn't allowed to defend Boney because why? Clearly a conflict of interest, given the prosecution role in Camm's first trial. And also, what is that telling you about Faith? I mean, the mindset of somebody so bloody minded, that's an individual concerned with ego and not about the reality of what the job was about, which was to bring to justice the individual guilty for the senseless, needless and horrific, brutal murder of a whole family. No, for him, it's about his reputation. That's what matters. Now, when the police are interviewing Boney, he starts giving really conflicting confessions. So ultimately, he's given a choice by investigators. He can either be a prosecution witness in the case and help to reconvict Camm, or be the sole defendant in a case and face a death penalty. Let's think about that for a minute. So, Boney, we know that you're a man of great character. You're very moral. I'm going to give you two options. One, you can be a witness and help put away David Camm, a completely innocent guy who didn't even kill his family, which you know because you killed his family. Or you can stand and be on trial and get the death sentence for being the murderer. Which one are you going to go for? I mean, I told you, infuriating, corrupting, horrible. To even be able to describe this to you, it riles me so deeply. Because all I'm thinking in this moment is, David Camm is in prison for the murder of his babies. And that doesn't go well in male offending. It really doesn't. Killing women and children does not set you in good store for experiences in prison. Imagine being innocent of all those charges and being placed in situations of great danger for yourself. Imagine the way you'd be treated in prison. And yet the police want him reconvicted. In fact, it gets so deeply distorted that the police even suggest to Boney how he and Camm could have connected. I mean, let's just say you did know David Camm. I don't know David Camm. Yeah, okay, you say you don't know David Camm. But let's just say you do know David Camm. Yeah? I mean, I don't know David Camm. I know, we've heard, we're saying, even though you don't know David Camm, maybe you do know David Camm. And if you do know David Camm, you could have met him through basketball, couldn't you? Just saying it. I could have. You could have. You met David Camm. You've played. You and David Camm meet regularly for basketball. That makes sense, yeah? Okay. Yeah. They literally proposed scenarios in which they could meet. So ultimately, Boney makes a final statement implicating Camm in the killings. And he changes his original story, and now he claims that he's met Camm playing basketball in a community park. And he said he'd agreed to sell Camm the gun that killed his family. He claims that Camm's the mastermind behind the killings. And Boney basically gives his following version of events. He says he used the grey sweatshirt to wrap the gun up. He'd gone to Camm's house on the 28th of September at 7 p.m. He hands Camm the sweatshirt containing the gun, even though it had his name in the back of it, but let's not worry about that. Kim and the kids arrive back from the pool. Camm then follows Kim's SUV into the garage. Boney had then heard 3 shots and saw that Camm had shot his wife and kids. Camm then turned the gun on Boney and shouts, "You did this," but the gun jams. So basically, obviously that means that Boney doesn't die. Boney then chases after Camm, who runs inside the house. And at this point, Boney reckons he stops and leans against the car to look in to see what had happened to the people who'd been shot. And apparently this is why the handprint was on the vehicle. I mean, somebody may imagine that he'd been prepped to speak that story. And even though he's got some kind of explanation for it, it sounds ridiculous. It's so dubious. He even admits neatly placing Kim's shoes on the vehicle. Well, what is it? Are you chaotically chasing somebody who's just threatened your life? Or are you thinking about neatly putting shoes on the top of an SUV? I mean, it doesn't make sense. But he says the reason he'd put his shoes on the SUV, even though there's a history of this fetish, is purely because he'd fell over them when he was chasing Camm. Well, at least you're very diligent with your health and safety, aren't you? Well, I'm just going to go and chase this offender. Oh, wait a minute, I'm going to come back and I'm just going to pop these on the top of the car because that could cause an accident. So anyway, yeah, he says that he'd put them up there after falling over them, and apparently they'd been off her feet. So somehow her feet had not had shoes on at this point. So it has nothing to do with his foot fetish at all, honestly. Nothing to do with that at all. Also, we have a problem in this statement because if you're going to organise murders and if you're going to connect with somebody regularly to get to a point where they're in a situation where they can provide you with a gun, you're going to have phone records, right? No. Not one phone call between Camm and Boney. And the reason for this is that Boney claims that every single one of their meetings was just by chance. By chance? Just by chance. I mean, that happens all the time, doesn't it? By chance, you just meet people and then manage to ultimately create a situation of significance like this. Just by chance. But that's the explanation. Furthermore, Boney claims Camm had killed the family just after 7 p.m. Other prosecution witnesses confirm that they were actually alive and at the pool at 7:15 p.m. The timeline doesn't even fit. Also, when the coroner explored the autopsies, he said that the deaths occurred at 8 p.m. Timeline doesn't fit there. Investigators literally didn't have a single piece of evidence connecting Camm and Boney. That's aside from Boney's highly dubious statement. However, unbelievably, shockingly, stunningly, investigators just won't let it drop. They are absolutely determined to hold Camm accountable. So Camm is rearrested and charged again with the murder of his wife and family. However, unbelievably, this time they add a charge of conspiracy to commit murder. And the investigators allege Boney as his co-conspirator. December 2005, Boney goes on trial first He's found guilty of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He's sentenced to 225 years. And we can all agree that's absolutely what he should get. He should get the rest of his life in prison or death. Simple as. Camm's second trial is 17th of January 2006. That trial takes place in Warwick County. Now, this is 5 more years since the killings have occurred. Thankfully, at this point, the, shall we say, dubious Stan Faith has been replaced by Keith Henderson as the county prosecutor. Prosecution at this point tries lots of different approaches within this trial because obviously they had the infidelity motive at the last one, but it isn't standing up. So despite the lack of credible evidence, prosecutor Keith Henderson accuses Camm of having molested his own daughter. And even goes so far as to say, look, the reason that you killed your family is because you wanted to cover it up. This was the incredibly flimsy allegation, and it was based on an injury that Jill had sustained, which was blunt force trauma to the genitalia. Yet in the first trial, the prosecution had claimed Camm had inflicted this injury on his daughter during the killing. And the expert evidence had indicated that the injury had indeed been sustained at that time. Now, though, they rely on testimony of one expert, witness Dr. Spivak, who literally miraculously changes her opinion at the last minute and decides that the injury has been inflicted hours earlier. This became the whole motive for the prosecution's proof of alleged molestation. And bear in mind, they also completely backtrack on the timeline of injury between the first and second trial, which is a massive problem. Like, what are you doing here? So basically the first trial that you're saying proved somebody's guilt with all this evidence and was found guilty on that evidence, none of that stands now, so you've got new evidence that makes them guilty in a completely different way. The defence argued that there was no evidence of sexual assault at all because when they looked as a coroner at Jill's body, her hymen was still intact. So essentially disproving that she'd been molested. They produced expert evidence establishing that the injury to her genitals was sustained during the awful attack and murder. The prosecution put forward a different version of events based on Boney's statement. So they say Boney had been present, that's why his sweatshirt and his handprint was there. However, he'd only brought the gun and Camm had carried out the shootings. The prosecution also claimed that Camm had confessed on the night of the murders to an investigator and confessed to an informant whilst in custody. Okay. Well, if that's true, WTF was this at the first trial? Because it wasn't mentioned. I mean, you're telling me you have a direct confession and you have somebody supporting that whilst he's in prison and that doesn't get introduced? 3rd of March 2006, it's unbelievable. The jury find him not guilty and... No, they don't! They find him guilty again. They find him guilty again. It's beyond comprehension at this point. A juror who was involved in that case later stated that the reason that they felt that most of them weren't guilty was because of the information that Dr. Spivak's testimony offered them. They genuinely believed that Camm had molested his daughter. And again, what you have to ask yourself there is, well, how relevant was that? So don't get me wrong. Listen, I don't want to see any sexual molesters on the streets. Seriously, for the most part, lock them up, throw away the key. I know that's very judgy. I appreciate that some people don't agree with that. But personally, I just think on a risk situation, children need to be protected. And most child molesters find it difficult to drop a predilection. I'm not saying all, I'm just saying I think quite a lot potentially do. So the reality is that if you think somebody's guilty of molesting their kid, then you're like, do I really care if they get guilty or not guilty? Because I'd rather not have them on the streets. So it's incredibly, incredibly emotive, because the truth is, if you're a child molester, massive probability is that you're not a murderer. So even if you had molested your child, you shouldn't be tried of triple homicide. But again, they're using the emotional blackmail of the jury to feel that they have a justification to send this man to prison. He gets life without parole. He appeals again. This time he claims that the allegations of sexual abuse are unsubstantiated. There is no evidence he's inflicted injury to his daughter. And also the allegation, rightly so, that this information had totally prejudiced the jury. Bear in mind what on earth is going on that the prosecution can pluck from the clouds an idea that he's a sexual molester when there's been no evidence. This isn't a first-person testimony. This isn't a child telling a parent and a parent speaking to the police. This isn't a school being afraid for the child, getting social services involved, making sure that that child is given an examination and so on and so forth. This is just a decided idea. A little bit, if I'm honest, like the Casey Anthony case. All of a sudden, it's the grandfather who's sexually molesting everybody, even though there was absolutely no evidence for it. But it manages to get a whole group of people convinced of guilt. And that means that bad decisions are made when it comes down to people who should be on our streets and who shouldn't be on our streets. And I'll leave it to your imagination what I mean when I'm talking about that in relation to Casey Anthony. Now, the Indiana Supreme Court fortunately agree that they don't think that this prosecution has been done in a way that they can feel sure of it, so they overturn it for a second time. Meanwhile, Henderson is removed as a prosecutor. I imagine that that's a relief to David Camm, and I'll tell you why. He's removed from the prosecution because he'd accepted a contract to write a book on the case. He'd even received an advance check and written much of the manuscript. So Camm's attorney had applied to have Henderson removed from the case, and Henderson fought that removal for 2 years. I wonder why. I wonder why he had fought that for 2 years when he had a major book deal stroke hopeful film deal. I wonder why. What could possibly have been the motive? I'm sure it couldn't have been money. I'm sure it couldn't have been corruption, could it? Camm is still in prison, by the way, during all this delay. And Henderson later, and rightly so, gets reprimanded for professional misconduct. Absolutely, as he should have. So far, let's think about that. We've got the conduct of both prosecutors in the first 2 trials, both highly questionable. We're now on the 3rd trial because the molestation allegation is a no-go. So the prosecution changes its approach again. So now we've had the first trial. Oh, that was meant to convict him on that evidence. That all got thrown out. Second trial. Oh, let's convict him on other evidence that's made up. That's thrown out. And now they're like, oh, we're going to have to think about a new tack around how to get this guy guilty. So they claim that Camm had carried out the killings for his wife's life insurance policy. Again, it's amazing that they didn't bring that up at the first trial. I mean, surely that would be a motive that they could have used, but no. So it just seems that every single trial, they just keep changing the allegations. And what's really amazing to me still is that even though we are on the 3rd trial, so far, the juries have been persuaded beyond reasonable doubt about these allegations, which is bizarre. So this time, and I'm thinking about how David Camm is in this situation. Imagine what he's been going through. It's his 3rd trial. Imagine him knowing how desperate the prosecution are to keep him inside. That it doesn't matter what truth and justice is anymore. This is about a vitriolic desire to keep him in prison, whether he's innocent or guilty. Prosecution claimed that Camm called his wife's employer early the morning after the murders and asks about the details of collecting on her life insurance policy. Now, during the 3rd trial, Boney gives evidence against Camm for the first time, and he sticks to the version of events in his dodgy statement, which he will, because when you construct lies, you stick to them. So like it's logical and linear, you kind of remember them as lies. Usually when you kind of are thinking about something on reflection, you have different memories come to you. It's why people's version of events change. Sometimes they get embellished, sometimes extra bits are added that are real. You know, this is the way it is because it's a memory of a memory of a memory, but usually a memory of something real. But if you've lied or you've been schooled in something, you stick to them. It's a bit like revising for an exam. You remember the facts and details. You don't remember the extra pieces that come into your memory because you were there. So he says he'd watched Camm shoot his wife and family and that Camm had then tried to shoot him. He also claimed that he'd never touched the victims. Despite Boney's history of stalking and armed violence against women, his previous convictions were ruled inadmissible at Camm's trial. However, fortunately, the defence were able to use new forensic evidence that had been found. So Boney's DNA on Kim's underwear, on the arm of her shirt, below which was bruising and abrasions, which thought to have been caused during the struggle with the killer. Also, there was DNA on one of her broken fingernails, on Jill's shirt itself, so it suggested that he played a far more active role in the killings than he claimed. Also, regarding Boney's handprint on the SUV, well, the defence argued that that was caused when he braced his left hand on the outside of the vehicle, knelt on the floorboard, and extended his right hand to fire the gun that killed 5-year-old Jill and 7-year-old Brad. Also, a face from the first 2 trials makes another appearance. Rob Stites, crime scene photographer, an alleged crime scene reconstructionist extraordinaire. The guy who mistakenly had alleged the crime scene had been cleaned up by Camm. Well, even though he's back for a different reason. This time he gives evidence for the defence, and he actually admits that he committed perjury, that he lied during the first 2 trials, that he wasn't a blood spatter pattern analyst, that he'd never even taken a basic bloodstain analysis course, and that, even worse, he had barely any scientific background of any kind. In fact, he had no experience of working as a crime scene analyst. He'd never processed a single homicide scene before this one. He wasn't a crime scene constructionist. He was not a professor at Portland State University, and he was not in the process of attaining a PhD. His only degree was in economics. He took a single chemistry course in college, and he failed it. Furthermore, he testified that the prosecutor from the first trial, Stan Faith, you remember when I talked about him, he had helped him fraudulently create false credentials. Investigators and prosecutors had clearly exaggerated Stites' qualifications. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? Rod Englert, Stites' boss, had backed up his findings, despite being fully aware of his lack of qualifications and experience. Stites' education and training were actually so poor that Faith had actually had to talk him through the scientific method prior to the trial. And his notes from the crime scene, which included identification of high-impact velocity blood spatter on the garage door, turned out to be petroleum-based fluid, not even blood. Yet Stites' evidence had been the basis of the prosecution's case and convictions. Now, had the jury known that he was utterly unqualified, the prosecution's case would have been massively damaged. Despite all of these lies, Stites would never be charged with perjury. Now, I imagine that's because he came clean, that essentially taking that stand and being willing to lose professionally, personally, and reputationally demonstrated a willingness to make good on what he'd done. But does that make up for the fact that an innocent man whose family had been murdered went to prison? I mean, personally, I think he got off very, very easily. The defence also highlighted evidence of police and prosecutorial misconduct in this case. There were mistakes in the collection of evidence and investigation of Boney as a suspect, the sweatshirt that was found at the crime scene that contained Boney's DNA, his girlfriend's DNA, his freaking prison nickname, and his Department of Corrections number. The DNA samples were not run through CODIS until the second trial. The name was never checked for a match. No one even ran his nickname through the database of nicknames mentioned by the Department of Corrections. His handprint was on Kim's car. The later analysis found touch DNA on both Kim and Jill. Kim's shoes were neatly placed on the vehicle, as is his fetish. And Boney had a known foot fetish driven assaults history. I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it? And the defence then state that the investigation had been appallingly handled, that there were allegations that Faith recognised Boney's nickname in the sweatshirt and protected him due to his relationship with his mother. Faith would later actually be asked if he ignored the sweatshirt DNA because it belonged to Boney, and he replied, "Absolutely not! I would turn in my own mother on something like that. Now, I'll give you that, Faith. I'll give you that if you wanted to fit your mother up for a crime that she hadn't committed, you'd hand her over without a problem, as long as you did your ego and reputation some good. So I don't deny that. I think you would turn anyone over to the authorities, even people that were completely innocent. Faith claimed that Boney hadn't been identified from the outset, as he hadn't realised his nickname was a backbone. He also claimed that he didn't meet Boney until after his first trial. Still doesn't explain why Boney's DNA name and handprint wasn't investigated and matched. I mean, for most investigators, that's a gift, isn't it? When somebody's handprint, DNA, and personal items and name turns up at the scene of a crime. That's pretty much bang to rights, isn't it? The fact that they didn't do that suggests either extreme unprofessional conduct or something even more duplicitous than that. Investigators have missed so many vital clues in this investigation. So despite assuring the defence that all the evidence had been collected and processed, they just made so many mistakes. So the defence then argued that the police had decided Camm was guilty from the start. I think we can all agree that's the case. This belief was based on completely erroneous evidence. They ignored forensic evidence that proved otherwise. They refused to admit that they'd made mistakes. They kept desperately, relentlessly, and unforgivingly pursuing Camm. The defence then claimed that the police helped Boney create a false account implicating Camm. They'd scared Boney. It was a black man accused of killing a white family. Therefore, there was a possibility of a death penalty, and that if he cooperated and testified against Camm, he'd have a better chance of avoiding the death penalty. The investigation into Boney had also been really poorly handled because they continually changed his version of events as more evidence contradicted his story. During the interview, police made suggestions which Boney then used in his story, for example, to explain the presence of his sweatshirt at the crime scene. Police said he'd used it to wrap the gun up that he was selling to Camm. Officers had also made Boney aware of inconsistencies in his story, and Boney had altered it accordingly. Also, there was really suspicious behaviour by Boney in the 2 weeks between his DNA being identified on the sweatshirt and his arrest, because he'd contacted the prosecutor's office over 30 times. I wonder who he was contacting. Did he have faith in the system? I wonder whether faith was involved in this. There was also an evidence tampering allegation. So it turned out that Boney had a distant relative in the police force, Myron Wilkerson. Now, Wilkerson had nothing to do with the case, but spoke to Boney at the station following his arrest. Wilkerson later removed Kim Camm's mobile phone from the evidence room, failed to sign it out, took it home, and when it was ultimately recovered, he'd wiped it clean of fingerprints. Guess what? Wilkerson was never charged with an offence for this. Is this driving you crazy? Is this introducing you to what corruption looks like in authority? Because it should. This should make many of you sat at home right now think about how those in power, if they want to do something, they will make sure it happens, no matter what the cost, no matter what the price, no matter what the impact, and no matter what the absolute destruction of the innocent individual has to face. And that is very telling. Also, in addition to the evidence tampering, there's also allegations of witness tampering. So remember, expert witness Dr. Spivak's sudden backtracking at the second trial regarding the time of Jules' injury in support of the state's molestation allegation. A little bit suspicious, isn't it? Meanwhile, a DNA analyst would claim that she was actually threatened by prosecutor Stan Faith when she refused to lie in court. I mean, good on her. Good on that DNA analyst, because that is hard. To stand in your truth and to say no to someone in power is hard. And people like her are brilliant human beings. She said no. He wanted her to claim that she'd found Camm's DNA on the grey sweatshirt. He cursed at her. He threatened to contact her superiors to get her sacked. He threatened to have her charged with obstruction of justice. Faith also tried to get a DNA analyst to lie and claim Jill's vaginal fluid or saliva found on the bedding from the master bedroom had supported the molestation claims at the second trial. Now, the prosecutors are supposed to seek the truth, not to coerce honest people into reporting inaccurate results to help them win a case. And what a bully. I could use worse words, but testament to those individuals who said no, because that is a hard position to be in. When you're getting threatened with your job and your future, that's a horrible situation to be in. So at this point, we've got to admit the prosecution case, it's not looking good. That is until the judge throws them a lifeline. The judge makes a controversial ruling. If the jury decides that Camm had not been the shooter, they could still find him guilty of murder if they believed he aided and abetted Boney. You're hearing me right. A special ruling. Oh, it looks like your guy is the wrong guy. But, you know, we've put a lot of money into these trials and a lot of people are going to look stupid. So what if we say that Camm kind of had some involvement and because of that you can just find him completely guilty? There's no evidence at all that Camm and Boney ever connected, aside from Boney's helpfully constructed testimony given by the police to him. Also, Camm had, at the second trial, been acquitted of the conspiracy charges, which means that this is contrary to double jeopardy rule, because if they're going to now find him guilty of conspiracy, that is an issue around that particular double jeopardy ruling. The defence also pointed out, look, if the jury conclude that Camm has not been the shooter, then blood spatter evidence was effectively being dismissed. Yet, this was the main evidence linking Camm to the murders. You can't have it both ways. They felt the prosecution had been given the opportunity to have their cake and eat it, basically. The lead defence attorney, Richard Camm, later stated, it was like the prosecution was able to say, well, if all our evidence is wrong, go and convict him anyway. Thankfully, and I mean thankfully, sanity prevailed. 24th of October 2013, think about that. This is 13 years after this man has been sent to prison for the murder of his entire family. On the 24th of October 2013, he is found not guilty of all charges. He walked free from prison the same day. Same day. That man spent all of those years not just knowing that his family had been brutally murdered, not just knowing that the whole world potentially thought he was guilty, but knowing that there'd been a calculated, constructed, consistent attack on him from the prosecution with one intention: to ensure that an innocent man spent the rest of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit or have any involvement in. A juror later stated that the prosecution tried to make the evidence fit their theory of the case. And that was all. It wasn't about the reality. It was totally about a case they tried to construct. Now, there have been so many criticisms of this case, and I'm sure that you've heard many of them in what I've said, but the police and prosecutors' handling of the case has received so much criticism. The police missed an opportunity to identify the true killer at the outset. There was a wealth of evidence identifying Boney. It was missed or it was ignored. The only real evidence the prosecution ever had was the dubious blood spatter evidence, but they were fearful that that wouldn't be sufficient, so therefore they made spurious allegations about Camm's character to create a motive to kill. So the first trial, it was infidelity. The second trial, it was molestation, child abuse. And the third trial, it was an insurance policy. Sean Boyne of Indiana University's Robert H. McKinney School of Law stated that judges in these trials allowed prosecutors to present, and I'll quote him, specious claims of motive designed to paint the defendant with a broad stroke of guilt and moral condemnation and overcome a lack of physical evidence. The prosecution constantly changed their story to fit the bill. The first trial, David Camm was the shooter and acted alone. The second trial, David Camm was the shooter, Boney aided and abetted him. Trial 3, Boney was the shooter and David Camm aided and abetted him. 3 cases, 3 changed scenarios. Even when the forensic evidence contradicted the prosecution version of events, they just downplayed it. They were confronted with overwhelming evidence that they prosecuted the wrong person. Prosecutors hate being wrong, but listen, most accept it and deal with it. Most accept it and deal with it because even a prosecutor is there to uphold the law. That's their oath. Not in this case. Not in this case at all. From the outset, David Camm was wrongfully charged with the murders of his family based on incorrect science by a crime scene photographer who had no formal training or experience in bloodstain pattern analysis. 2nd of June 2003, there was an ethics complaint lodged against Rod Englert with the American Academy of Forensic Science. Several bloodstain experts alleged Englert misrepresented his education, training and experience. Now I will tell you, Englert is suing them for slander. So it's not my job or duty to tell you who's right or wrong. I'm just giving you the details. One of the complainants who's raising this is Herb McDonald. Now he's the founder of Blood Pattern Science. The founder. This is a guy with great diligence and experience. He described Englert as a forensic whore, liar for hire, a very smooth charlatan, and the Bin Laden of bloodstains. He's not holding back there, is he? But when you've created something and somebody bastardizes it, in your opinion, uses something that's meant to be for good to do great harm, I can imagine that it creates quite a visceral and cerebral and emotional experience that you want to just express. That said, as I said, that case is happening. Now, what were the public's reaction? Well, David Camm served 13 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Despite his clear vindication, I'm telling you now, some people are bizarrely convinced of his guilt. I hope they find this video. I hope they see this come up on YouTube. I hope they search for his name because they want to convince themselves that he's guilty. And I hope they bloody well sit and listen, because believe me, this has been diligently researched. I've missed nothing out. I'm not the prosecution. This is playing out as it really occurred. So if you believe he's guilty and you've got to the end of this and you still do, you're delusional. Sorry. Because you're like the prosecution. You're holding on to something that isn't real because you don't want to change your mindset. And I see that all the time. I see people, even now, in recent times, people who can see evidence playing out in front of them, literally clear evidence, and they hold on to the beliefs that they've kept because it's too much of a stretch to accept that they were wrong. It's so much better to accept that you are wrong. When you are wrong, you learn and grow, you develop, you change, you don't do harm. So if you've got to this and you still think he's guilty, watch it again. And then do it with an open mind. So the fact that some people are convinced of his guilt mean that many from his hometown believe that he's been wrongly acquitted. In fact, in Camm's hometown state of Indiana, vandals spray painted "Fry Camm, Make Bacon." He also faced civil litigation filed by Kim's parents trying to prevent him from recovering more than $600,000 in life insurance. They still firmly believe he's guilty. How? I have no idea. I appreciate where money comes into things. There is a real issue. $600,000 is a lot of money. And with respect, I'm sorry, Kim's parents have lost grandchildren and a child, and that is the worst and most brutal and horrific experience to go through. Absolutely. And they will have loved their grandchildren and their daughter so poignantly, so absolutely, and so purely with respect than probably David Camm. And that's no disrespect to David Camm, but when you have a child, they are your everything. And grandchildren are an extension of that. You can't replace them. And that's not to say that people can replace wives and husbands. I appreciate they are irreplaceable, but it's not the same. It's not quite the same love. So for them, they may believe that their loss is greater than his. And he may not agree with that, but it's understandable why they believe that themselves. Nonetheless, that $600,000 is his. It's his. When you are a spouse, the life insurance belongs to you. It's not for us to judge morally who should have it. It's just legally. But they want him to be guilty. Maybe they believed what was said about the molestation and adultery. Maybe he did have affairs with different people, but that doesn't mean he's guilty of murdering his family. And it doesn't mean he should have served 14 years in prison where clearly he didn't do it. Since the acquittal, Camm has filed a lawsuit against several investigators, prosecutors Sem Faith, Keith Henderson, plus Rob Stites and Rod Englert, as he should have. The claims included malicious prosecution, evidence fabrication, unlawful investigation, arrest and imprisonment. Claim was initially dismissed. I don't know how. How was his claim initially dismissed? What's that? They fitted you up initially. They gave a known felon with a shoe fetish who clearly murdered your family an alibi to make him seem less of an issue and you seem more. They even gave him a suggestion of how he met you. What have they done wrong? They've done nothing wrong. Oh, they brought in a witness that didn't have any qualifications to completely convict you. Shit happens. Move forward. Anyway, fortunately, the Federal Appeals Court reversed the decision and they ruled the lawsuit could move forward to trial. Now, Camm has already settled a lawsuit against Floyd County for $450,000. He's also filed a $30 million lawsuit against the state for violation of constitutional rights, which was, in fact, dismissed. Again, I don't think it should have been. I think 30 million is a bit too much, but this is what they do. There's a lot of litigation. People make a lot of money, don't they, from their percentage if you happen to represent somebody. But 30 million seems a little bit excessive. But who knows, 14 years of his life was stolen. So to some degree, maybe he did have recourse for that. After his release, Camm was hired as a case coordinator by a newly formed non-profit organisation investigating innocence. He's also made various public talks about problems with current judicial systems. He says the system is unfairly weighted in favour of the police and prosecutors. I think we agree with that, even when they convict innocent people. And the fact that he hasn't been able to sue lots of people yet suggests that that kind of sounds like it's true. He also says there's a lot of injustice in the justice system. I absolutely agree with him. In reference to the police and prosecutors, Camm stated, it becomes about winning and winning at any cost. Now, there was shoddy crime scene work. There was a rush to judgment led by police, some of whom had been his friends, would you believe, to blame him for his own family's murders. And those trials cost the taxpayer $4.5 million. Camm stated, time doesn't heal anything. I can't dwell on those things or it would tear me apart. I think that is a brave way of reflecting on what happened. And I can understand it. If he looks back at what he's lost, his whole family, his beautiful children, his freedom, his reputation, parts of his community, then how can anything good come of it? But if he focuses on what and who he is now, what he's learned, what he's developed, how he's grown, and the work that he now does to prevent others facing similar situations of harm, then his life has some meaning, doesn't it? It has purpose and value. I told you you'd be frustrated. Have you been frustrated? This is absolutely abhorrent. For a man to have gone through 3 trials before being finally given his freedom, to lose 14 years of his life and his family, it's unforgivable. To know that this wasn't just a miscarriage of justice by mistake. This was a miscarriage of justice by design is scary. Because what we want in our moments of great pain and fear and loss, if traumatic losses occur, is the prosecutors, the police, the legal system to be on our side, to lift us up when we are falling, to heal us when we're broken. And to know that instead they can conspire together at will to totally destroy an innocent human being at all costs doesn't make me rest easy at night. I hope you found this interesting. I hope if you have stumbled across this because you're very much against David Camm, that you've learned something. I don't want to patronise you, but you've got to listen to the evidence, the actual evidence, not hearsay, not the bull that you've read, not the absolute lies that have been told. You have to listen to the evidence, and it is clear. They assassinated David Camm's character to make you feel that he was guilty. But somebody's character does not make them guilty of murder, certainly not a triple homicide of a family that he loved. Thanks for joining me. Let me know your thoughts on this. Have you heard about this case before? Is this the first time you stumbled across it? It's interesting, isn't it, that it kind of relates to another case that I've covered. Let me know your thoughts. If you've liked this and you want to hear more, then please subscribe, get your notifications on so you never miss anything. Give me a comment, a little thumbs up. Join me for a live because I have the most amazing crime community, Kenny's Crime Cult forever. And I'm usually there to have a chat with you guys. And if you haven't done that before, honestly, take some time because the people who join are freaking awesome. Like, it's a proper little family. It's getting bigger, but we still manage to keep the kind experience of community in one place and space where we all feel like we're valued. So do join me then. Again, big shout out to Patreon. You really are making a difference to my content creation. It blows my mind that you do it. It really does. But every single person who comes there to watch or to comment or to like, you all have the same value. You really do. I cannot believe that you do. And thanks for making this channel something that's growing and something that means the world to me. Take care. See you soon. Kenny's Crime Cult forever.